indigenous people of the United States will now come to order. Welcome, everyone. I note that a quorum is present. The subcommittees are meeting jointly today to hear testimony on examining the policies and practices of the Bureau of Indian Education. I know for the subcommittee that Ms. Bonamici of Argonne is permitted to participate in today's hearing with the understanding that her questions will only come after all members of two subcommittees on both sides of the aisle who are present have had an opportunity to question the witnesses. This is an entirely remote hearing. All microphones will be kept muted as a general rule to avoid unnecessary background noise. Members and witnesses will be responsible for unmuting themselves when they are recognized to speak or when they wish to seek recognition. I also ask that members please identify themselves before they speak. Members should keep their cameras on while in the proceeding. Members shall be considered present in the proceeding when they are visible on camera, and they shall be considered not present when they are not visible on camera. The only exception to this if they're experiencing technical difficulty and inform the committee staff of such difficulty. If any member experiences technical difficulties during the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform. Make sure you're muted and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, whose number was provided in advance. Should the chair experience technical difficulty or need to step away, Ms. Ledger Fernandez, as chair of the House Natural Resources Subcommittee for the Indigenous People of the United States, or another majority member is hereby authorized to assume the gavel in the chair's absence. This is an entirely remote hearing, and as such, the committee's hearing room is officially closed. Members who choose to sit with their individual devices in the hearing room must wear headphones to avoid feedback, echoes, and distortion resulting from more than one person on the software platform sitting in the same room. Members are also expected to adhere to social distancing and safe health care guidelines, including the use of masks, hand sanitizers, and wiping down the areas both before and after their presence in the hearing room. In order to ensure that the committee's 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time using the committee's field timer. The field timer will appear on its own thumbnail picture and will be named 001 timer. There will be no 1 minute remaining warning. The field timer will show a blinking light when time is up. Members and witnesses are asked to please wrap up promptly when their time has expired. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, opening statements are limited to the subcommittee chairs and the ranking members. This allows us to hear from our witnesses sooner and provides all members with adequate time to ask questions. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. So today we're meeting to examine the role of the Bureau of Indian Education in serving American Indian and Alaska Native students. The federal government has a trust responsibility to Indian tribes bound by both the United States Constitution and moral responsibility. Education is a core part of this obligation. Unfortunately, our commitment to faithfully educate and support American Indian and Alaska Natives, or AIAN, students have been marred by generations of abuse and neglect. A report released last month from the Department of Interior on federal Indian boarding schools from 1820 to 1969 found a history of low quality education, militarized strategies to erase the identity of AIAN students, and fiscal, sexual, and emotional abuse. Tragically, these actions carried out by the people entrusted to educate our children likely contributed to the deaths of at least 500 American Indians and Alaska Native students. Today, the Bureau of Education, or the BIE, has a key role to play in fulfilling the federal government's commitment to providing a high-quality education to AIAN students. BIE schools honor ancestors and sustain traditions, signaling to students that they belong in school. Research shows that students from underrepresented backgrounds, including AIAN students, have higher achievement rates when cultural specific elements were incorporated into their curriculum. Despite the importance of BIE schools, American Indian and Alaskan Native students are still in need of educational resources and support. A 2021 study showed that BIE students perform more than 2 grade levels below the national average. Even when compared to AIAN public school students, BIE students were still roughly 1/3 of a grade level behind. And research confirms that AIAN students experience higher than average rates of depression and suicide. Unfortunately, the pandemic only compounded the consequences of our multi-generational neglect of AIAN students. During the pandemic, Native Americans lost their lives at higher rates compared to other demographics in the United States. Student achievement declined and mental health challenges worsened. The loss of tribal members inflicted an immeasurable loss to Native Americans' traditions and languages. Now more than ever, the education and future of American Indian and Alaskan Native students and communities fall on the strength of BIE-funded schools. To that end, over the past 2 years, congressional Democrats have secured historic investments in education, including $990 million in dedicated funding to help AIAN students get back on track. BIE schools can use these funds to protect the health and safety of students and staff, address learning loss, and support students' social and emotional needs. However, we know these investments alone will not solve the underlying issues that BIE schools face. According to the studies conducted by the Government Accountability Office, poor management and accountability challenges have prevented BIE from repairing dilapidated school facilities, fully serving students with disabilities, and meeting students' academic and mental health needs. Today, we have an opportunity to examine the steps BIE is taking to fulfill its responsibility to students. I'm committed to securing sustained and strategic investments to ensure BIE can improve its operations and address the urgent challenges facing AIAN students. For example, President Biden's budget proposal for fiscal year 2023 called for $1.6 billion for the BIE, a $500 million increase above the fiscal year 2022 enacted level, including more than $890 million for K-12 education. These investments are not only critical to the education of our nation's students, but to the future of American Indian and Alaska Native communities and our constitutional commitment to them. So thank you again, Director Dearman, for your service to AIAN students, and I look forward to our discussions alongside Ms. Shirwa of the Government Accountability Office. Thank you, and I now recognize Ranking Member Mr. Owens of Utah for the purpose of making an opening statement. Mr. Owens, please. I think you need to unmute, Mr. Owens. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that.
No
thank you, Mr. Chairman, and also your witnesses here. I'm looking for this conversation. BIE has long been plagued by problems, has been on the Government Accountability Office, GAO, high risk status list since 2017. The report issues 65 recommendations for improving BIE operations and performance, but as of December 2020, 22 of these recommendations remain open. The schools funded by BIE frequently fail to provide students with an environment that keeps them safe and healthy. For example, December 2014, Minneapolis Star-Tribune ran a 4-part series on BIE schools focused on the dilapidated state of the school buildings and argued that the decrepit conditions are common throughout the system and neglected by the federal government. A 2015 political report called BIE schools the worst schools in America, citing, and that says a lot, the worst schools in America, citing one school on the Navajo reservation that ranks that had cracks running down the walls, leaky pipes in the floors, and asbestos in the basement. Additionally, while these schools spend more per pupil than non-BIE public schools, students' performance is consistently lower than that of traditional public school students, including that of the Native Americans. The rate of graduation in BIE schools are 53%, which is far below the national average of all Native Americans, which is 69%, and even worse compared to the national average of all students of 81%. It is clear these schools aren't giving students the education they deserve. I know BIE has undertaken multiple efforts to reform and reorganize to better support students, but also know these reforms seems to have been unsuccessful so far. I look forward to hearing more from our witnesses about steps BIE is taking to finally address GAO's recommendations, but also steps BIE is taking to address the far more important problem, which is way too few students are graduating with skills and knowledge they need to succeed. Thank you, and I yield back. Jeremy, on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Owens. I'd now like to recognize the chairwoman of the subcommittee, House Natural Resources Subcommittee for the Indigenous People of the United States, Ms. Ledger Fernandez of New Mexico, for the purpose of making an opening statement. Ms. Ledger Fernandez, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair Sablan and Ranking Member Owens. And also I would like to thank Skip Ranking Member Representative Opal Nothi. We are all gathered here with the interest of education for our Native American children or Alaska Native and Hawaii Native children. I can tell you, I visit with Native American leaders across my district and across this country regularly. We talk about lots of issues, but without fail, tribal leaders will bring up education.
Ms. Ledger Fernandez, hold on.
Delivering quality education that also is rooted in cultural values and the linguistics of the tribe. Last month, am I breaking up?
Yeah, actually,
Last month I heard from one tribe in Washington that worked with schools so that the tribal students are now taught tribal history and
yeah, I think we've lost. I think we've Ms. Ledger Fernandez. I think we've lost her. Can staff give me an update, please?
Chairman Sablan, I still have Representative Ledger Fernandez's connection to the platform. However, I think it is bouncing between strangling bandwidth for video and audio. I have visual confirmation of Chair Ledger Fernandez back on the platform. However, I do not have audio confirmation from Chair.
Is the connection cutting out, Mr. Chair?
Yes, Chair Ledger Fernandez,
Yeah.
your connection is breaking up. It is switching between video.
Here's what we'll do. We'll go to Mr. Abernathy and come back to Ms. Ledger Fernandez, please. Mr. Abernathy, sir, your opening statement. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Chairman Sablan and Chair Ledger Fernandez. Appreciate your rescheduling today's hearing, a very important hearing. It's disappointing, I know, for all of us back in May that we had some technical challenges that required it to be rescheduled. And unfortunately, it looks like we're having some technical challenges with the hearing today. You know, this is an oversight hearing. One of the reasons why it's so important to all of us, but also I think underscores the importance of trying to get back to a schedule of in-person hearings. These technical challenges, I think, are frustrating for not just us, but for our witnesses and for the members of the public that watch. And I think we're more effective as an oversight body when we're sitting on a dais in the same room. We can see each other, we can see the witnesses, they can see us. And so I'm hopeful that we can get back to a schedule of in-person hearings. So today, obviously, we're examining the policies and priorities of the Bureau of Indian Education. This is something that is of critical importance to everyone on this committee, charged as they are with providing educational support to the more than 30,000 students who are located in or near Indian reservations. Now, I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for including the Government Accountability Office in this hearing. Originally, I think they were not scheduled to be included, and their input is going to be critical to our deliberations here. As we have heard The GIO in 2017 included the BIE on its biannual high-risk list of federal programs that are especially vulnerable to waste, fraud, and abuse or mismanagement, or that need transformative change. Obviously, given some of the statistics that we've seen quoted, this designation by the GIO was not a surprise to those in Indian country. The BIE has just been facing challenge after challenge, spanning back decades. So to be clear, we in Congress have an oversight responsibility towards agencies like the BIE. That oversight does not have to be adversarial. I think that we're all on the same team here. We want to empower the BIE to do their mission and improve the quality of the education that we're providing to these students. But there are still challenges that remain. Of those 39 open GAO recommendations in 2017, as of the latest report in January of last year, there are over a dozen of them still outstanding. So obviously we have some work that still remains ahead of us. So I'm hopeful that the inclusion of the GIO in this hearing will enable us to work with the BIE and try and solve some of these problems. Before I yield back, I want to talk about how encouraging it is to see the bipartisan nature of the cooperation on this committee, especially with respect to the GAO, and I'm hopeful that continues. I think the inclusion of other outside witnesses is very helpful to the business of the committee. It certainly improves our transparency, and I think it improves our ability to enhance accountability throughout the entire process. So I'm hoping that we're going to continue to be able to work together on a bipartisan basis in that way. Looking forward to the hearing, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Obenarty. We'll circle back to the chairwoman of the subcommittee for the indigenous people, Ms. Ledger Fernandez. Please, your opening statements again. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. And I think I might be breaking up again. This is the issue of when you are in Indian country. We don't really have great broadband. Can you hear me now?
No, I'm sorry. Teresa, I think it says your bandwidth is low, so you're coming in and out. Yeah, you're coming in and out, and then your photo is you're freezing.
Yeah. Yes, if you can hear me, I mean, the issue is that where we do not have Wi-Fi where I'm at. I'm actually in Indian.
Yeah, I'm truly sorry. I do not want to do this at all, but like Mr. Obenarty mentioned, we already postponed this hearing once. I'm going to ask that Ms. Ledger Fernandez opening statements be included in the record, and so we can move on and this hear from our witnesses. Ms. Ledger Fernandez, can you please make a statement asking that your statement be inserted into the record? I appreciate that. Think we have lost. There is
Mr. Chair, would it suffice for me to make a request for unanimous consent that the chair's statement be included in the record?
Yeah, that'd be nice. Thank you. Is that a statement, Mr. Obenarty?
Yeah, I request unanimous consent that Chairman Ledger Fernandez's opening statement be included in the written record for this hearing.
All right, and without objection, so ordered. Thank you. So let's now proceed to our witnesses. Without objection, all the members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. on July 12th. I will now introduce the witnesses. Mr. Tony L. Dearman is the Director of the Bureau of Indian Education, a role he has held since November of 2016. Mr. Dearman is a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and brings more than 2 decades of experience as a teacher, coach, and administrator in BIE-operated and tribally controlled schools, including implementing much-needed reforms. He began his career in education in 1993 at Sequoia High School, a boarding school operated by the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. Ms. Beth Shirwa has been an assistant director in GAO's Education, Workforce, and Income Security team since 2011. For the past 10 years, she's worked on issues regarding Bureau of Indian Education schools, producing numerous reports on topics ranging from school health and safety to special education services. She has also overseen several studies on higher education and Department of Education K-12 programs. Before joining the Education and Workforce team, she worked for seven years as an advisor in GAO's Office of Congressional Relations. We appreciate the witnesses for participating today and look forward to your testimony. Let me remind you that we have read your written statements and it will appear in full in the hearing record. Pursuant to Committee Rule 80 and Committee Practice, you're asked to limit your oral presentation to a 5-minute summary of your written statement. Before you begin your testimony, please remember to unmute your microphone. During the testimony, staff will be keeping track of time and a light will blink when time is up. Please be attentive to the time. Wrap up when time is over and remute your microphone. If you experience technical difficulties during your testimony or later in the hearing, you should stay connected on the platform. Make sure you're muted and use your phone to immediately call the committee's IT director, whose number was provided to you in advance. After the witnesses make their presentations, we will move to member questions. When answering a question, please remember to unmute your microphone. The witnesses are aware of the responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittees, and therefore we will proceed with your testimony. Assistant Director Sirwa, please, you have 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Chairman Zablan, Chair Ledger Fernandez, Republican Leader Owens, Acting Ranking Member Obernolte, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss the Bureau of Indian Education and GAO's high-risk list. In 2017, we designated improving federal management of programs that serve tribes and their members as a high-risk area. One component of this area is BIE's administration of schools. We included this area due to the agency's significant management weaknesses in supporting and overseeing its schools serving American Indian students. Our high-risk program is intended to help inform congressional oversight and improve government performance. Since 1990, 67 different areas have appeared on our high-risk list. Of these, 27 areas have been removed. On average, these areas had been on the list for 9 years. An agency must meet 5 criteria to be removed from our high-risk list. The criteria focus on leadership commitment, agency capacity, action plans, monitoring, and the agency demonstrating progress to fix the high-risk area. We have made 32 high-risk recommendations related to BIE's administration of schools dating back to 2013. These recommendations involve a variety of management issues, such as the need to improve school health and safety, fiscal oversight, school construction, provision of special education services, and distance learning. Currently, 10 of these recommendations remain open, including 1 priority recommendation on BIE's provision of special education services. However, implementing our recommendations alone will not result in BIE's automatic removal from the high-risk list, because the conditions that led to the recommendations are indicative of systemic management weaknesses. Since we last reported on BIE's high-risk status in March 2021, the agency has fully met 2 of the 5 criteria for removing its high-risk designation, specifically the criteria for leadership commitment and having action plans in place. Senior leaders have demonstrated a strong commitment to address the management weaknesses we have identified and provided continued support to fix those issues. Also, BIE has developed corrective action plans to address a range of management challenges, including a long-term capital asset plan to guide its school construction projects. In addition, BIE has developed a plan to build schools' capacity to address building safety issues, including at its dormitories. However, BIE needs to do more work to fully address its remaining management weaknesses. As in our March 2021 high-risk report, we continue to rate BIE as partially meeting our remaining 3 high-risk criteria: agency capacity, monitoring, and demonstrated progress. In terms of capacity, the agency continues to have an overall staff vacancy rate of about 33%, the same rate we reported in 2021. Further, BIE's School Operations Division, which provides vital administrative support to schools, currently has a vacancy rate of about 45%. We believe these staff vacancies continue to hamper BIE's ability to support and oversee schools. BIE has also struggled with monitoring. For example, it has not fully implemented our 2020 recommendation to conduct risk-based monitoring of schools' use of federal special education funds. Furthermore, BIE needs to demonstrate additional progress by implementing our 10 open recommendations and improving overall management of its schools. In conclusion, we believe that BIE has demonstrated leadership commitment and the ability to formulate action plans to address key management weaknesses. However, it will need sustained focus and concerted actions to fully meet the 3 remaining criteria for removal from our high-risk list, especially in the area of increasing staff capacity. This concludes my statement. I would be happy to respond to any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Shirwa. Director Dearman, welcome back actually, and thank you for coming back since we had to postpone our last hearing because of technical issues, but welcome back, and please, you have 5 minutes for your opening statements. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Sablon and Ledger Fernandez, ranking members Owens and Overnolte, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to appear on behalf of the Bureau of Indian Education.
Yeah, Director, could you turn your video on?
I apologize.
Okay.
Thank you for inviting me to appear today on behalf of the Bureau of Indian Education. I am Tony Dearman, a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and director of the BIE. Today, I'm joining you from one of our off-reservation residential schools, Sherman Indian High School. I'm on site for a Principal Leadership Academy. It is an innovative way that we're reaching our school leadership teams to discuss important issues facing our students and sharing best practices to accelerate learning outcomes. I've been an educator for 29 years as a science teacher, coach, principal, and administrator. I've invested my entire career in Indian education. I 16 years for the BIE at both the school and administrative levels. The BIE serves approximately 47,000 Native students from 574 federally recognized tribes. My video keeps shutting. I apologize, Chairman. My video keeps timing out. Cameras. It's not playing. There it is. Okay. BIE serves approximately 47,000 Native students from 574 federally recognized tribes. We educate our students in 183 elementary and secondary schools and dormitories. Of these schools, the BIE directly operates 54, while the tribal governments operate the remaining 129 schools through grants or contracts. The BIE works to respond to the challenges we face in providing high-quality education to BIE students across 23 states. As we work to improve local service delivery, the BIE focuses its attention on using our resources to create the most impact for our students. We're working to achieve the agency's core mission and increase accountability throughout the BIE. 5 years ago, in February 2017, the GAO listed the BIE in its high-risk report. At that time, the GAO highlighted a number of challenges that limited the BIE from achieving its mission to serve Native students. A few of these include school safety, construction, and the obstacles we face in recruiting and retaining a highly skilled workforce. As noted by the GAO in its most recent high-risk report, the BIE has made progress. To date, the BIE has successfully addressed and closed a total of 23 of 39 GAO recommendations contained in 10 separate reports, including 22 of 32 recommendations identified as being high risk. Although challenges remain, I am certain that we will continue to make significant progress towards all the GAO remaining recommendations. BIE is actively working on implementing the GAO's recommendations while we navigate the unprecedented impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our students and Native communities. In the face of new and evolving challenges, BIE pivots how services are delivered to Bureau-operated schools and how support is provided to our tribally controlled schools. Throughout the last 2 years, the BIE team focused on providing services essential to the health and well-being of students and their families. Achieving each of these goals requires creative solutions. For example, many BIE student homes do not have electricity, much less access to adequate internet suitable to shift to online learning. During the summer of 2020, the BIE initiated and executed a comprehensive school reopening plan. The Bureau-wide effort resulted in successfully procuring and issuing more than 10,000 laptops and 7,000 Wi-Fi devices to students. Throughout our response, the BIE team established and maintained two-way communication with BIE partners, tribal leaders, and stakeholders. This is both through formal and informal paths, including a series of consultations, listening sessions, and other forms of strategic direction. The BIE also established cooperative working relationships with the Centers for Disease Control, the Indian Health Service, and White House leadership. Overall, the BIE received approximately $1.5 billion in COVID-19 assistance. These funds have served a critical role in BIE's ability to address the challenges of providing educational services in the COVID-19 environment. For example, the BIE also used COVID-19 supplementary funds to establish its first ever education learning management system. This effort empowers the BIE to invest in IT infrastructure. We've used this funding also to provide professional development for teachers and school leaders. The BIE is also using COVID-19 supplementary funding to support the physical and mental health of our students, in addition to procuring and distributing millions of masks and hundreds of thousands of COVID-19 testing kits. Thank you for your public service. I am honored to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Dearman. I just like to take note of the difficulties that we're having with Chairwoman Teresa Ledger Fernandez staying on with the hearing, and that add a little bit also with Mr. Dearman shows some of the connectivity issues we may be having with parts of the nation. Although I must happily say that I am having no such issues where it's 1:30 in the morning your tomorrow, and where Miss Ratty Wagon is at 4:30 in the morning yesterday. So everyone, we're getting there a little at a time, but we're certainly getting there, and we'd like to have this no connectivity issues with our Bureau of Indian Education schools as well. Under Committee Rule 9A, we will not question the witnesses under the 5-minute rule. After the chairs and ranking members, I will recognize members of both subcommittee in the order of their seniority on the full committee. Again, to ensure that the members' 5-minute rule is adhered to, staff will be keeping track of time, and a blinking light will show when time has expired. Please be attentive to the time wrap up when your time is over, and remute your microphone. As chair, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Director Dearman, in its 2017 report, the Government Accountability Office has said it was adding the Bureau of Indian Education's Administration and Oversight Schools to its high-risk list because of evidence of unsafe school conditions, inconsistent school health and safety inspection, lack of workplace planning and poor oversight of school spending of federal funds. In its subsequent reports, GAO also identified other high-risk issues such as the BIE's oversight of special education at schools. So could you discuss how the BIE has addressed or is addressing these high-risk issues? Are there high-risk areas that continue to be a challenge for the BIE to address? How can we as legislators support your efforts to address areas of high risk? And what actions have you taken to provide leadership and support to address GAO's recommendations on the BIE's high risk status? If you can swing all of that in, that'd be appreciated.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the question. I became director in November of 2016, and we were placed on the high-risk list in 2017, and we gathered our leadership team immediately to address the GAO recommendations. And we will continue to address the GAO recommendations. As we've stated in our opening remarks, we have closed 23 of the 39 recommendations, and we feel comfortable and feel confident that we'll continue to work hard to close the remaining recommendations. We have a lot of the recommendations in getting close to packaging, closure packages for some of the recommendations, and we continue to work collaboratively with GAO. GAO has been a great partner, and as I've stated in previous hearings, Chairman, we will continue to work with GAO and use their recommendations as a roadmap to continue to make BIE better. We need the assistance. We feel like we totally agree with what GAO is saying, and we are proud of our leadership team in BIE because we are the most consistent leadership team that the BIE has had in the history of the organization. And we will continue to work hard to implement the recommendations, Chairman.
Well, thank you for that. Because, you know, like I am aware of educational jurisdictions that are in high risks, some of who have been in high risk for 20 years, and I understand maybe 30 years, and it's costing the local jurisdictions a lot of money. So thank you for that, Mr. Dearborn. Director Siwa, which of the recommendations that are still open do you believe will have the greatest overall impact if addressed? And what do you believe is a reasonable time for BIE to implement these recommendations?
Yes, we have one priority recommendation that is still open, which is for BIE to improve its delivery of special education and related services. Specifically, we recommended in 2020 that BIE develop a plan to make up missed special education services on a consistent basis across all BIE schools. We found in our report that BIE was not providing consistent services when their providers were out sick or absent for other reasons. That is the most important of the recommendations we feel for BIE to implement.
And so what do you believe BIE will have to take immediately to be able to achieve this target? And how has GAO been working with BIE to help achieve this timeline?
As Director Dearman testified, we do have very collaborative relationships with BIE and with Mr. Dearman and his leadership team. They have reported they are working to address our 10 open recommendations, including the one I just mentioned, to develop a consistent policy to make up missed special education services. Director Dearman would probably have a better idea of the time frame for their implementation of these outstanding recommendations.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Ranking Member Owens for his 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Owens, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Dearman, your testimony provided a good update on the BIE progress and addressing recommendations made by GAO over the last several years. You also discussed challenges BIE schools have faced during the COVID. What I didn't see in your testimony was any discussion about the low academic performance of BIE schools. Are there steps that BIE is taking to increase the learning outcomes of students in these schools? Mr. Dearman?
Thank you, Congressman. We have a lot of first evers in the Bureau of Indian Education, and we have our first ever owned standards assessment and accountability system that we've been working to implement. This past year is the first year that we've actually been able to collect the school data, or we'll be collecting school data from the assessments. Our plan is, Congressman, is to look at the data and make sure that we're filling in the gaps, providing resources based on data to fill in the learning gaps that we've experienced through the learning loss, through the pandemic. I can tell you this, Congressman, it is hard for me and my leadership team to hear the opening statements with the statistics that's been read and that's been the history of BIE, but I am proud to say that we are changing that. And we went out for consultation, we listened to our stakeholders, our tribal leaders, and it was important that we have our own standards assessment and accountability system so that we can have our own data and have control of that data versus having to work with the multiple states that our schools reside in. As I testified, Congressman, we have schools in 23 different states. We're having to try to work with 23 states in collecting that testing data. So that is the plan moving forward, but also with our new standards assessment and accountability system, we will have benchmarks to where we can start measuring where our students are and what we need to do to make sure that we address any learning gaps or any deficiencies that we may identify through the assessments.
Thank you. I want to focus my next question on one of the GAO reports you highlighted in your testimony. In May 2020, GAO released a report highlighting BIE's failure to provide special education student services they were entitled to under federal law. That was a report that was requested by Republicans on the Education and Labor Committee. From your testimony, it appears that in the 2 years since the report was released, none of the GAO's recommendations have been fully addressed. You mentioned a new special education policy and handbook that are forthcoming that you anticipate will fully address GAO's recommendations. Can you tell us more about what will be in the policy and handbook, and how they will address GAO's recommendations?
Thank you, Congressman. Our anticipation, we anticipate having the policy and handbook this summer and ready to go out to our schools and start training. What we will have in our policy is guidance and expectations and the special education as far as servicing our students. The one key thing that the GAO did recommend that we make sure that we ensure is in the policy and the handbook is compensatory services, because we have to make sure that during the pandemic, we had to shift to a virtual setting, and sometimes we had to shift to packets, and making sure that we are meeting the needs of our students that have individual education plans is critical. Since my tenure as director, Congressman, the one thing that we've experienced in the Bureau of Indian Education is the lack of policies. And it's important that we put policies in place so that we can make sure that regardless of who is in the leadership positions, our schools have guidance that they can follow, and it's written to where they can pull that off the shelf and make sure that our special education services are provided.
Okay, I had just less than a minute here. Ms. Siwa, I want to ask you this about the same report. How would you describe BIE's progress in implementing the recommendations from that report?
As I mentioned in my statement, BIE has not closed any of the 7 recommendations we had in our May 2020 special education report. As Mr. Dearman testified, BIE has told us they're working hard to develop policies to implement our recommendations. One thing that BIE did do shortly after our report was issued, though, was they rescinded the policy at their largest division of tribally controlled schools not to inspect 100% of documents on provision of special education services to students. At the time we did our work, the Office of Tribally Controlled Schools was only looking at, I believe it was 1/3 of all students' special education service delivery. So that's one positive thing that BIE did very shortly after our report was issued.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And Chairman, I yield my time back.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Owens. Now we welcome back, of course, the always hardworking and wonderful person to work with, the Chairwoman, Teresa Ledger Fernandez. You have 5 minutes of questioning, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to everybody on this hearing. My apologies. I am actually in with Navajo meeting on health issues, and so as we all know, we have a major issue without sufficient internet, and I had to come back into Gallup. So I wanted to address some of the issues with regards to underfunding. We did in the markup on the bill with regards to school construction, talk about the manner in which school construction is incredibly underfunded. And we look forward to working with the chairman and the committee to increase the percentage that goes towards the Native American schools for construction. But I want to talk a little bit about the concept that we spend more on BIE students than in others. From the data I'm aware of, it's actually the opposite. And Assistant Director Sira, as you know, we have amazing schools like the Santa Fe Indian School in my congressional district, which has tremendous success and student outcomes. It's also Pueblo governed. But we know that there are so many other schools that are not as successful and that they're significantly underfunded. I saw that the Department of Education reported that AIAN students are funded at 6,048, less than half of actual funds expended to educate non-Indian schools at 12,500 for fiscal year 2022. So how would the president's proposed $5 million funding increase for BIE in fiscal year 2023 help address the issues of inadequate funding of tribally controlled schools?
This is a question for me.
Yes, or
Okay.
if it's whichever you.
Sorry, I'll defer to Director Dearman.
Okay.
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. We are definitely pleased with the president's 23 proposed budget because we do have increases. I'll throw some figures at you that will definitely show you the need of our system. In facilities alone, our budget is $420 million, and we have a deferred maintenance approximately of $915 million. We have 60 schools that are listed in poor condition that have not been funded yet as of now. And with that, we're looking at approximately $5.1 billion to replace the schools in poor condition. But again, we are pleased that we have an increase in the president's proposed budget, and we look forward to to working closely with this committee and other committees in supporting our schools.
We also have the issue of the BIE educators and being able to retain and keep them when they are paid higher. New Mexico, I think we need to put more money into our schools. We recently did have a salary increase of $10,000 per teacher. What strategies are you going to use, and what do we maybe need to do at the federal level to make sure that when surrounding states increase wages for their teachers, there isn't, a transfer of talent out of our BIE and tribally controlled schools?
Great question, and thank you so much, because that has been a focus of ours in the Bureau of Indian Education. Currently, Congresswoman, we have 2 states that pay higher than the Bureau of Indian Education pays, and that is Oregon and California. We are aware that New Mexico increased their pay rates. And so what we have done in our Bureau operated schools is we've also increased ours to make sure that we're very competitive. One of the things that we've done also in the Bureau of Indian Education is coming in as a leadership team, we realized immediately that we had higher credentials or qualifications, and it was more difficult for teachers and applicants to qualify for teacher positions in BIE. So we adjusted to match the state qualifications of the 23 states that our schools reside in. which really helped us increase our applicant pool, make us more competitive. We've also been creative in making sure that we are offering incentives and providing trainings to our school leadership so that they can understand what funding pots that they have available to recruit and retain teachers. As far as staff that assist using the technical or provides technical assistance to our schools, we've been creative in that way as well by actually looking at remote positions. Because in BIE, the one thing that we have found out is if we can recruit locally and have people that know our culture, our traditions, know our communities, we have less turnover. And it really has a positive impact on our students and our communities. So what we've started doing too is when we classify a position that could be advertised remote, guess what? We don't have to pull individuals from our tribal communities and have them report to an office somewhere that they don't want to live. We can actually set them up in their communities and have them as a remote employee and actually bring in people that know our communities, our cultures, our traditions, and know our tribes. And we're excited about that, and we look forward to that.
Thank you. We'll need to also make sure we get broadband to them so they can actually work in Indian country, as we've just discovered. I have some more questions and we will submit those in writing, especially in my opening statement. I had really emphasized the importance of language and being able to have the fluency in language and including that in the school curriculum. I will submit those in writing. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you ever so much for your patience.
No, thank you. And yeah, you would think that connectivity will become a problem when you come to where Amata and I were at the end of the world where it drops off. But we're doing fine. So no, a lot of hope that things will get better for all of us, especially for Native American schools. Now, Mr. Abernathy of California, sir, thank you also for your patience. You have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman Sablan. And thank you to our witnesses. Mr. Dearman, I'd like to direct a couple questions to you. Thank you very much for being here. It was very comforting to me to hear you talk about the transparency department and the fact that you agree with the recommendations that are made by the GAO and that you're working diligently to fix them. You were having a conversation with Chairman Sablan about the status of those remaining recommendations. Could you talk about the timeline on which the department proposes to have those remaining recommendations implemented?
Thank you, Congressman. What we can do is actually go back and break them down because there's 10 separate reports. And I think it would be, I'd appreciate it if we could respond in writing with each recommendation with an estimated timeline.
Okay, well, that would be great. I'll tell you what, we'll talk about what is the recommendation with the furthest time horizon and what is that horizon?
There is one that we have, again, understanding how unique the Bureau of Indian Education is. We have to work with other departments across Indian Affairs. And there is one that we've been working on with Indian Affairs that's pretty much out of our control, but we are working hand in hand to make sure that we assist. And I believe that is recommendation 17247. There's a recommendation 447. So there is a recommendation there that one is the one that it would be hard to list the timeline, but we will definitely continue working with the Division of Facility Management and Construction around and getting that implemented.
Okay. So one of the disturbing pieces of testimony, and from my point of view that we've heard today, is when the GAO has said that merely crossing off all of these recommendations off the list will not be necessarily sufficient to remove the department from the high risk list. And specifically, the GAO is saying two things. First of all, that the staff vacancy rates are alarmingly high, which the statistics they quoted, I would certainly agree with them. Also, though, they said that the BIE is failing in some of their risk management responsibilities. So I'd like to talk about those two items because obviously everyone here on the committee would like to see the BIE get off of the high risk list. The staff vacancy rate, you were just having a discussion with Chairman Ledger Fernandez about this. If you're paying competitive salaries and you've got a great applicant pool and you're implementing remote work, why are these vacancy rates so high? And what is the department's plan to bring them down?
Great question. This is, like I said, Congressman, this has definitely been a focus of the Bureau of Indian Education. In addressing we have different levels. We have what we call a Title V category, which are our employees that are here to provide technical assistance to the schools. And currently, we have a 68%, all 68% of our positions are filled. 32% are vacant. At the school level, we have 91% of our positions totally filled with 9% vacant. As a total in BIE as a whole, with approximately 3,500 employees, we are at 89% filled with an 11% vacancy rate. We hire based off of Indian preference. And we find out, and I'll give you an example of that, Congressman. We just closed a position where we had close to 70 applicants. By the time we apply Indian preference to the applicant pool, we were down to 7. By the time we go in and we look at the qualifications to meet the qualifications of that position, we were at 1. So when we hire Indian preference, we have to do a better job of getting out in the communities, getting to job fairs to show our tribes that there is a great opportunity to come into the Bureau of Indian Education as well as other departments within Indian Affairs. I really feel like, Congressman, and we have increased this, we have actually hired 2 talent recruiters within the Bureau of Indian Education to actually go out and recruit from the colleges and universities that have teacher ed programs. But more importantly is getting, as I stated earlier, getting community members that know our communities to look at BIE as an opportunity to come in for employment, because we want and we need our tribal leaders at the table with recommendations of how we can get better, but also bringing in some of our community members, our tribal members in our school system. So we've been creative in addressing our vacancies, and we'll continue to be creative in addressing our vacancies.
Okay, well, thank you. That's going to be critical to getting off the GAO's list, high risk list. I see I'm out of time here. I've got some other questions related to risk management that I'll submit in writing. But as I close, let me just make the point that we see the number one statistic that bears on the job that the BIE doing is that of student achievement. And it's been troubling to me that some of the statistics that the BIE have been prioritizing and collecting, you were talking about collecting data, are not the ones related to student achievement, but ones relating to other things like absences. So we would really like to see you focus on student achievement. I'll submit the other questions in writing, but thank you for your testimony. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Obernolte. I now like to recognize Mr. Soto. Sir, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman. We're here today because we need to make sure we're continuing to conduct our oversight duties and maintain confidence for the American people, particularly our Native American families. I do want to announce on the onset, we've come a long way. Those of us who sat through excruciating hearings about abuse in the past in education institutions and in health institutions that were run by the federal government long ago know how terrible a sin the country has committed, and even going back to historic times early on with the nation. But our job here is to right injustices, historic injustices, and to make sure that we never go backwards again. So when we see concerns about the Government Accountability Office discussing that the Bureau of Indian Education is listed as a high-risk agency, when there are concerns about COVID-19 pandemic funds, which happen in local governments too, by the way, and oversight of COVID relief funds, addressing learning loss, mental health issues, staff shortages, students with disabilities, infrastructure. It's important for us to continue to conduct our oversight duties. This is about families. This is about children in Native American tribal sovereign lands. Director Dearman, in a 2017 report, the GAO found that 19 of the Bureau's school construction projects were completed between 2003 to 2016 and took 3 or 4 more years than expected and were about 20% over budget. This spans several administrations. We understand that 4 new campuses open to students in 2021 and another 3 are to be completed in 2022 with more planned. What is the current state of schools' facilities and the status of replacing those in poor condition?
Thank you, Congressman. This is something that I feel like in 2006, when we became our own Bureau of Indian Education became its own bureau in 2006. The one thing that was missing in that process was service level agreements to establish clear roles and responsibilities of who's responsible for what in our facilities department. Since then, I am proud to report that we have been working closely with Division of Facilities Management and Construction, as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to make sure that we have these service level agreements in place. We work with DFMC to make, because we do what we call a quarterly facility condition index report. And this is how critical our Maximo system is which is a system that we go in and we train our schools to enter all the deferred maintenance issues within the school. And in our tenure, you will have observed an increase in deferred maintenance, because again, it's important for us to make sure that we have accurate data to provide to our tribes as well as Congress, so that we can identify the areas that we need support and assistance with.
Please continue.
We continue to work with DFMC and the Bureau of Indian Affairs to address the deferred maintenance issues. We have a list of schools actually listed as far as FCI scores, and that hasn't been done in years. So I feel like we are standing things up, working collaboratively with departments across Indian Affairs to address our facilities issues throughout our system.
Thank you, Director Dearman. My second question is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected progress on these school replacements and more generally construction and repairs?
Thank you, Congressman. Great question. As stated earlier in some of the opening remarks, our tribal nations was hit extremely hard by the pandemic. And I am proud to say, and I'm proud of my BIE leadership team and our field staff, we've been able to support all the tribes that we have worked closely with. So if we had construction, first thing we would do is pull in our tribal leadership to make sure that we were aligned with their executive orders that they had in place, whether it be shelter in place, but we worked with our tribes. And Congressman, I will need to go back to the department, but I'm not aware of projects that were being held up and that were postponed due to the pandemic. But I'll verify that and provide that in writing.
Thank you, Mr. Director Dearman. We appreciate you supplementing your answers today and giving us greater confidence that we're streamlining these processes for more efficiency. And I yield back.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Soto. I now like to recognize Mr. Allen, please. Mr. Allen, you have 5 minutes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Good, good. Well, listen, I want to thank Mr. Chairman, you and Ranking Member Owens for this hearing today. I'm a firm believer in that parents should play a role in our children's education. And of course, parent involvement in education has been a major topic this year. And of course, piggybacking on Mr. Obenolte's question as well, I guess my first question with regard to teachers, what is the starting salary for a teacher? You said you had 70 apply. What's the starting salary for a teacher? Mr. Dearborn.
Thank you, Congressman Allen. I don't have that figure right now in front of me, but I can definitely provide that.
Okay,
I stated, we have been monitoring the states that pay more than the BIE because we want to make sure that we're very competitive.
right,
There are issues that we are looking at as well is in recruiting staff from public schools in the government, they can only bring in 5 years of retirement. And so what we are finding out is that we're going to get staff at the very beginning of their education teaching profession or at the very end, because Congressman, it's hard to pull state teachers that have been invested in the state retirement 15 years and recruit them to where they can only bring 5 in to the BIE. So there are some things that we've identified.
and because these schools are located on the reservation, they cannot participate in state retirement programs?
They are federal, we are a federal system or a tribal system, depending on how the schools are operated.
Right.
Congressman, I do need to say this too. The one thing that really impacts our recruitment of teachers is also our quarters, because we have to make sure that we have quarters to recruit teachers too. And right now, our quarter situation, that is something we're working across the department to make sure that we address, because some of our quarters, Congressman, make it hard to recruit teachers.
Well, give me an example of those.
We have 1,988 quarters across 87 sites. And I feel like that throughout this process of separating the Bureau of Indian Education, no clear lanes of responsibility, some of the quarters have, they're in poor condition. And moving forward, I am proud to say that we've been working across Indian Affairs. We have these service level agreements in place and working with the tribes to where we can actually, we have plans moving forward to address the quarter situation. But that is one thing, Congressman, that has impacted our recruitment in our, especially our isolated areas where there's no other housing around, is the quarters. And I want to make sure that I'm on record as saying that does impact teacher recruitment.
Right. So a teacher has to live on the reservation as a requirement of employment?
No, sir, that's not it. But some of our locations are so far from the nearest city or town that it's hard for them to drive an hour and a half, 2 hours, sometimes even 3 or 4 every day, one way to the school site.
Right. So you operate totally independent from the state in which you reside. Is that correct?
As far as benefits and pay, yes.
Okay. All right. So as far as parental involvement in education, have any of your parents of the children requested the opportunity for their child to be educated and off the reservation? In other words, let the money follow the student to give them a better chance of accomplishing their goals?
I'm not aware of parental requests at this time, Congressman, but that's something we can definitely put out a data request to see if we have parents that are requesting that.
Right.
We do have schools and at sites where there are no other options, but then we also have a lot of schools where the parents do have options to send their children.
I think it'd be good to listen to your parents and their needs and give every student the opportunity to succeed. And that's why, I'm so positive about school choice and all across this country. All right. Well, I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Mr. Allen. I now think this is going to go faster than we thought. So I now like to yield and wake up Miss Raduagan, who's all the way at home in American Samoa. Aloha. Ms. Raduagan, you have 5 minutes, please.
Aloha, and
Aloha.
thank you to Chairs Ledger, Fernandez, and Sablan, Ranking Members Obernolte and Owens for holding this joint hearing today. And thank you to the panel for your testimony. Couple questions here for you, Director Dearman. How has the Bureau of Indian Education provided instruction to students enrolled at boarding schools during the pandemic? and have all boarding schools reopened for in-person learning?
Great question. Our residential settings have been,
Their biggest problem.
that was a challenge. Feedback, I apologize. That was a challenge. We currently have 44 residential settings within our system, and 22 of those are operated by the tribes, and 22 we directly operate. And again, I am proud of my teams because we work closely with the tribes. And if the tribes put in executive orders or shelters in place, or they wanted us to go remote, we would shift to remote to support our tribal leadership and protect our tribal community members. At certain locations, depending on the community's access to the internet, depending on the IT equipment that was located at the school, we had to take a lot of things into account to determine how we were going to make sure that we shifted and provided a virtual education to our students. So it's going to vary throughout our system. And again, just looking at the different scenarios and situations with IT equipment, broadband, we could talk about this for hours because it's unique and so different and across our 64 reservations that we have schools located in. But moving forward, I will say this, we had weekly meetings with Indian Health Service, CDC, because we wanted to make sure that we provided the safest structure, working along with the local health authorities and tribal leadership in all of our settings, not just residential, but all of our settings, to make sure that they were safe in returning our students and our staff. And I feel confident that we accomplished that.
Thank you, Director Dearman. My time is very short and I've got another question. Now, inflation and rising fuel prices are sure to impact the Bureau being able to support transportation for these students. How much additional funding will be needed to maintain current level of service because of these rising costs?
Thank you for that, Congresswoman. I am happy to say that, again, we have increases within our budget that we anticipate will assist with this. That's yet to be determined because of the gas prices in different locations, but we will definitely work closely with our schools to pull that data. And we work with our schools if they are experiencing shortages or problems. That's our job, is to come in and provide technical assistance and be creative in finding solutions to help our schools. As of right now, I don't have the data that you've asked for as far as gas impacts on our school operation, but that is definitely something our school operations teams working with the schools will definitely keep an eye on.
Thank you. Thank you, chairs. I yield back the balance of my time.
All right, thank you, Ms. Radiwagan, and thank you for making the effort to join us at such an early time for you as well. I now like to recognize Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, I see a video, a picture of, but let me see if Mr. Grothman's not in. See who else is here. Mr. Benz of Oregon. Sir, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have a number of questions for the director, Mr. Dearman. I served on a private Catholic school board for 6 years, and then I served on a public school board for 3. One of the things that was appalling when I went to visit my schools, not the private school so much, but the public school, was the incredible lack of enthusiasm expressed by many of the middle school students. You should understand that I live in one of the poorest, if not the poorest, counties in Oregon, and our buildings are old and dilapidated, and I worked with my community to finally, after 31 years, get a bond passed to add to our high school and improve our middle school. But still, much to be done. And so I have sympathy for anybody who doesn't have good buildings, but I also understand how it takes a community to try to make that situation better. It also, I think, takes a community to try to make your kids enthusiastic about learning. And what I figured out, along with a number of other people, is that you had to do something in these communities to make the kids enthusiastic about learning. So Mr. Dearman, I ask you, what makes the children in the Indian country enthusiastic about learning?
Thank you, Congressman. Sounds like you've been in the classroom. You know, my belief in education has always been we have to make sure that we take care of our students emotionally, physically, before they're ready to learn. And addressing that situation, especially coming out of the pandemic, is going to be critical.
Mr. Dearman, I need to have you answer the question.
Yes.
What I'm asking you is, what makes your kids enthusiastic about showing up at school and actually learning? What is it that prompts them to want to learn? I just need a very short, concise answer, and tell me where you got the answer.
Connecting what the students are learning to what they know in their world, their tribal. That's why I say we need to hear from tribal leaders, and this is where I'm getting this from, Congressman, is our tribal leaders want to be at the table. They are at the table, and making sure that we're teaching the culture, the traditions, the languages of their tribe so that our students can connect. Our job is to connect what's in that textbook and apply it to their everyday life to make it mean something to our students and make it to want to learn.
Well, and let me follow that up with, what is your truancy rate? How many kids aren't showing up?
You know, Congressman, that's going to be something we're definitely going to have to go back and track, because through the pandemic, we've had so many schools that have shifted to remote, to hybrid, and that's going to be something that we will have to go back and pull the data from. And
but why don't you, Mr. Director, you're not answering any of my questions, and I find that unsettling. Would you tell me how the truancy rate was prior to the pandemic? You've been there 3 years prior, so tell me about that.
Truancy rate prior to the pandemic, I don't have the exact figures in front of us, but we could definitely provide that to you. And it's going to vary on location because of the situations that we have in some of our tribal nations.
Well, I'm looking forward to you supplying those numbers. They're extremely interesting to me, and I think everybody else, because all I hear about is we need more money. I haven't heard a word about how many of the kids are actually showing up to work. And to that end, Director Dearman, does the BIE have an employee performance appraisal plan?
Yes, sir, we do.
And I need to see a copy of it.
Absolutely.
And Mr. Dearman, it's been more than 2 years since the beginning of the pandemic. Has BIE developed and distributed guidance for schools on developing and implementing the distant learning programs that you kind of alluded to a few minutes ago?
Yes, we're in the process of developing a distance learning handbook. As I stated in my opening remarks, Congressman, we're implementing an education learning management system, something that we need within our system, and we will be providing the guidance through an official document for all of our schools to follow. Our tribal
and if I may, thank you for providing that. My last question is the one I started out with. What, in your opinion, and tell me where you've had a chance to refine it, makes your children our children on these Indian country spaces enthusiastic about learning? I have not heard the answer.
Enthusiastic about learning in our tribal nations is connecting what's in that textbook to their everyday life and including culture and traditions.
And where do you get that answer? Have you talked to the kids about this?
I'm hearing that from our tribal leaders, and also anytime we implement programs around culture, traditions, and language within our tribal schools, the interest and involvement increases.
Thank you, Mr. Director. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bench. Let me hold on, please. Thank you. Let me see, Mr. Keller. Mr. Keller, you have 5 minutes of questioning before I move on to Mr. Cotton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dearman, thank you for being here today. You indicated that BIE is working on a policy and handbook to address GAO recommendations related to the Johnson O'Malley program. Could you please tell us more about the plan and how it will address the GAO's recommendations and improve the program?
Thank you, Congressman. This has been a long process through tribal consultation, listening sessions, and it's something we wanted to hear from our stakeholders. Out of the GAO's 5 recommendations over the Johnson O'Malley program, we have closed 2, and we have 3 that are remaining And the policy and handbook, we feel, will definitely implement these recommendations. Congressman, the issue that we've encountered in BIE is the lack of policies within BIE. And that is something our team is working hard to establish. And we feel like this is it's a document that's needed. And once this policy and handbook is published, we feel like it's going to assist our contractors and give them the information that they've been asking for.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. So you closed 2 of the recommendations and 3 are remaining, is that correct?
Yes.
When did you get the GAO recommendations?
These are 2020 recommendations.
Okay, so it's been 2 years. And maybe this isn't for this meeting, maybe there would be a time frame on when you expect to have the 3 remaining closed.
Yes, we can provide that. I'd like to take that back to the department and get with my team and actually reach out to GAO, and we can provide a timeline of the expectation of those 3 closures.
Well, I would think that if education is that important, we'd already have that timeline and a plan to make sure we're meeting those milestones and those metrics to get to those metrics. But I'm going to keep on a couple other things here, if I may. Mr. Dearman, as part of the BIE's response to one of GAO's reports, you discussed the Bureau of Indian Education's effort to assess its use of strategic data and reform the way the agency collects and uses its data. What steps does BIE have in place, or is BIE implementing? So what is being implemented to protect the security of that data? And what technical assistance and oversights does BIE provide to its schools to ensure compliance with the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act?
Thank you, Congressman. I feel like there's 2 parts to that question. I want to talk briefly about, we are standing up a Chief Performance Office that's collecting and monitoring our schools. And that's something we've been working closely with GAO around. The data, I'm going to shift to virtual now. The data that the reason I feel like we're protected with our student data and our PII is because we work within the Department of Interior. All of our IT functions are supported by the Office of Information Technology and Management, which is part of the Department of Interior. All of our 53 BIE operated schools have to meet those qualifications, and they have a hand in on everything that we're doing with any of our programs that deal with student data or staff data.
Okay. The other thing I wanted to touch on was a little bit, you mentioned that BIE is continuing to work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs to implement improvements to the distance learning in the BIE funded schools. Can you describe more specifically how the plans to resolve those recommendations from GAO?
The recommendations on that one, Congressman, we are anticipating having closure on those with the implementation and the handbook for our education learning management system. BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, involvement with implementing the IT infrastructure would be around the area of facilities improvement. The Office of Information Management Technology is another part of Indian Affairs. They will have a hand in making sure that the switches, all the needs, the infrastructure needs as far as IT are met. So we've had 3 different agencies or sections of Indian Affairs at school locations, making sure that we have the support that our schools need.
Okay, just a question that I have really, how do you interact with the U.S. Department of Education? Is there any functions that they provide you with that might be best practices that would be helpful?
We have regular scheduled meetings with the Department of Education. And so we do have some, I feel like we have a strong rapport with the Department of Education.
How does the Department of Education, their interactions with you differ from that of states or other governments?
Great question, Congressman. The Department of Education, we submit reports. In some areas, the Department of Education considers our own state. The states that our schools reside in, we've started reaching out and wanting to make sure that we have communication with the states that our schools reside in, because it's important that we work together to support our schools. In some of our states, we actually have cooperative agreements with the state's education department that our schools reside in. So it's going to vary, Congressman, depending on.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think if we're concerned about education just
Keller.
across the board, I would
Mr.
think that we would treat everybody the same, working with the U.S. Department of Education and state departments of education, regardless
Keller.
of whether you're a public school that's not, part of the Bureau of Engineering Education and the schools within the jurisdiction. So I think there's some work we can do to make sure everybody gets the same and the best practices. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Mr. Keller. Now let me recognize Mr. Cawthorn. Please, you have 5 minutes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That really means a lot. Ms. Sirwa, how does the GAO monitor BIE's implementation of its recommendations? And is it monitoring more extensively than normal because the BIE is on the high risk list?
Yes, we do monitor BIE's implementation of its recommendations much more closely than agencies that are not on our high risk list. We have usually quarterly meetings with Director Dearman and his staff to talk about their progress in meeting our recommendations. So we really try to track where they are with our recommendations and when they're planning to close them.
Wonderful. And would you say in your experience that the BIE has been generally cooperative with your organization?
Yes, ever since Director Dearman came on board in November 2016, we've established an excellent relationship with him and his management team, a relationship that was not as positive prior to Mr. Dearman coming on board.
Excellent, excellent. So one follow-up question, please, Ms. Sirwa. What are the obstacles to completing the list of recommendations that, in your opinion?
Well, we have 10, as I said, we have 10 high-risk recommendations, excuse me. I think one of the problems in terms of implementing them, as I talked about earlier, is I think their very high vacancy rate, which is now 45% agency-wide. Excuse me, 33% agency-wide. But with that high vacancy rate, they do not have the staff available, enough staff available to implement, I think, a lot of our recommendations.
Interesting. Oh, well, thank you very much, Ms. Sirwa, for your comments. And Mr. Director, if you don't mind, I'm very proud that I get to represent the koala boundary in the Eastern Band of Cherokee on the reservation. The Eastern Band, from what I understand, supports legislation that would create a Truth and Healing Commission to study the federal boarding schools that many Indian children were forced to attend. What are you doing to support efforts to study the legacy of Indian boarding schools?
Thank you, Congressman. And I do want to make sure that I go on record with saying the residential schools of today are not the boarding schools of the past. We are working with tribal leadership, and you're going to hear me say over and over that I'm very proud of my team across the Bureau of Indian Education, because we have schools on 64 reservations, and we want our tribes at the table. But we have implemented language programs. We've implemented culture classes. We need our tribes at the table. We are also working alongside the department, and I know that Secretary Holland is going out for some listening sessions, her and Assistant Secretary Newland, and we will be attending those in the locations of our residential settings to listen if there's any ideas that we can grab hold of and make our system better. But I will say that, I would welcome any of the members, anytime you're close to any of our schools, drop in and see us, drop in and see how we're doing with taking care of our kids. Congressman, we have 44 residential settings across our system, 22 that we directly operate and 22 that tribally control or our tribes operate. And I'm proud of our residential staff, because think about being a parent or guardian to hundreds of kids in a dorm, and it's definitely a unique situation. Congressman, I would like to say one thing to close that out with is, my daughter graduated from one of our residential boarding schools.
Well, that's excellent. I'm really glad that, from your testimony, that it sounds like the boarding schools are doing excellent now. But Mr. Director, my question, if you don't mind me rephrasing it, is there any efforts to try and study the legacy and the long lasting, whether it's harms or benefits that have happened from the reservation boarding schools of past?
Thank you, Congressman. I feel like in a lot of our tribal, let me address this. Yes, we have been in our communities, depending on the location of the schools, we have boarding school survivors that have, they may be on our school boards, they may be on our parent committees. They're involved in a lot of our locations in the operations of our schools. So we do have involvement with that. Throughout this process of the investigation, again, Congressman, the BIE will stand in support, and we will continue to learn how we can get better. We identified, Congressman, through our strategic direction, which was the first ever for the Bureau of Indian Education, behavioral health wellness needs across our system. We identified that actually before the pandemic, working with tribal leaders and stakeholders. And we feel confident that we have things in place to address any of the situations that may arise in our boarding school, our tribal communities, our day schools. But we feel like we were ahead of the game by addressing in our strategic direction the needs, behavioral health and wellness needs of our tribal communities.
Thank you.
Mr. Director, thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Siwa. I really appreciate it this morning. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. Now go to Representative Stansberry. Ms. Stansberry, you have 5 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of our chairpersons and our ranking members for holding this hearing today. And I want to say thank you to all of our educators who serve on these committees, and to all of the educators out there who are listening in. Thank you for serving our communities. Thank you for serving this vital role in helping lift up our children and help prepare them for their futures. I have one message this morning, which is please fund BIE schools. The federal government has a treaty, trust, and moral responsibility to fund these schools. We signed hundreds of treaties as a nation with tribal nations. We made commitments over the last 150 years that we would ensure that our Native children had not only an adequate education, but a brilliant education that would help to prepare them for their futures. And we need to fund these schools. It is Congress's responsibility in partnership with the administration to ensure that we are doing that. And that is why myself and 25 colleagues sent a letter to the Appropriations Committee asking the committee to fully fund our schools, the construction backlog, and to provide support for our tribal colleges and universities. I know this is an oversight of the administration's role in BIE, but we in Congress also have a fundamental moral responsibility and a fundamental tribal trust responsibility as well. And so it's not only on our BIE colleagues who are here today, but on us. And so I really want to emphasize that this morning. I want to thank you, Director Dearborn, for being willing to step up and to play this role as the director of these programs. During the Obama administration, I worked at OMB and was on the panel of individuals that was helping to bring forward some of the reforms for the BIE. It's a long road, and I know that we will be working on these issues for many years. I'm grateful for your leadership and your dedication to these schools. As we've been talking this morning, these BIE schools provide vital education to over 40,000 Native students across the country. I want to emphasize, especially for my colleagues this morning who've been asking questions about school choice, some of these schools are in places where this is the only school that is available for hours of driving. These schools are historic, they are in communities, they provide tribally and culturally and linguistically appropriate education, and we need to be making sure that we are not only providing the administrative supports for these schools, but that they have adequate funding to replace decrepit buildings and maintenance issues, that they're able to hire these teachers that are from these communities, and that there is the proper bureaucratic structures in place to partner with tribes, to consult with tribes, to ensure that we're meeting the needs of those students in those schools, and that ultimately, if tribal communities want to take control of these schools, that they're able to. And so all of that takes strong leadership and addressing many of the issues that have been identified. I want to take just a moment here to emphasize the needs in my district. We have a number of tribally controlled schools and BIE schools across New Mexico. In my district, the Untitled Chapter of the Navajo Nation has a school that desperately needs to be replaced. It was built in a floodplain as a boarding school. It is no longer adequate. These kids have been sent home. There is not sufficient Wi-Fi for these kids to be learning. And so Director Dearborn, my plea to you and my ask of you this morning is, will you commit today to make sure that we are meeting the needs of Tohajale Community School and we are prioritizing that school to get it rebuilt in a safe way so that our kids can go back to school?
Yes, I'll commit to that. And thank you for your support.
Thank you, Director. And I know that these are a priority, obviously, for you, for your staff. I want to thank your staff for their incredible commitment. We also have Pueblo schools across New Mexico that need facility support, that need help getting staffing and teachers there. But again, before I sign off here with my time, I just want to emphasize we must fund these schools adequately. This is not about school choice. This is not about having schools that do not that invest too much money. This is about underinvestment of funds. This is about the history of how the United States historically made commitments to tribal communities that we would provide sufficient funding to educate Native children, and about ensuring that we make good on those promises, that we provide the funding that the US government promised that it would do so, and ensure that we are investing in those schools and all of the supports that our students need. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning and for holding this important hearing.
Thank you, Ms. Stansbury. I can see a video stream of a chair and apparently in Mr. Grothman's office. I can't see Mr. Grothman. So I'm going to assume that all members have asked their questions, and without objection, move now to ask the gentle lady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, to ask her questions for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Chair Saban. Thank you to the chairs and ranking members for holding this important hearing. And thank you, Director Dearman and Assistant Director Sierra, for being here. The Chemawa Indian School in Salem, Oregon opened in 1880. It's the oldest continuously operated residential boarding school for Indigenous students in the United States. Chemawa has a complex and painful history, including recent concerns related to student health and safety, academic shortcomings, treatment of employees, questionable hiring practices, and a lack of financial transparency and oversight. I've been working since 2015 to obtain accurate, timely information from Chemawa leadership, BIA and BIE, and I continue to be concerned about the outcomes and safety of Native youth, especially at Chemawa, and whether they're receiving a high-quality, trauma-informed, culturally relevant education. I appreciate the GAO report and the conversation today about it. I also want to highlight the Department of Interior's investigation into Indian boarding schools and thank Secretary Holland for her leadership. Our nation has not yet fully reckoned with the painful history of federal Indian boarding schools like Chemawa. Director Dearman, nice to see you. We've met and discussed issues regarding Chemawa many times. Although there have been attempts to improve the conditions at Chemawa, and you've talked about that today, and I appreciate that, we know that there's still more that needs to be done. So what work has the Bureau of Indian Education done to specifically improve oversight at Chemawa? And also, what is your progress in implementing the recommendations found in Volume 1 of the Interior Department's Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, and where do you need additional support from Congress?
Great to see you, Congresswoman.
Thank you.
You know, Chemawa, and thank you for recognizing that we have met multiple times to address concerns. The oversight of Chemawa, right now, we do have an OIG. I think OIG was requested to go in and really look at the expenditures of Chemawa Indian School. And once we receive those recommendations, we have been meeting with OIG around that. But once we receive those recommendations, we'll definitely look at implementing those to make us stronger and make sure that our oversight is improved. As I stated earlier, I'm proud to say that we are standing up a chief performance office within BIE that will also have oversight over expenditures, of the monitoring visits, and that's something we've been working closely with GAO around. School operations is another way that we are confident that we are going to provide more oversight. We've actually established funding lines to identify different funding streams that our schools are utilizing for expenditures and providing trainings around allowable expenditures from our division performance accountability as well as our school operations. So Congresswoman, I feel like I'm confident that we are implementing and making improvements throughout BIE, that it won't just have a positive impact and as far as oversight with Chemawa, but other areas across our system.
And what about, Director Dearman, what about the Federal Indian Boarding Initiative? There were several recommendations made in that. How is that going?
What we will do is, we definitely, first of all, appreciate Secretary Holland and Assistant Secretary Newland's leadership in that area. Volume 1 lays out the groundwork moving forward. I will say that we will be attending the listening sessions that Secretary Holland is going to be going out conducting, because we need to hear from our former students at the residential boarding schools or the residential schools, so that we can not wait on a report, but start taking what we're hearing from our survivors, our people that are former students, and actually looking at how we can implement recommendations immediately and not wait on a final report. So we plan on having staff at each location listening sessions.
And I do want to try to get another question in. We know that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, American Indian and Alaska Native students needed access to mental health services. We've had that conversation. Native youth have a higher average rates of depression and dying by suicide. These issues have only become more acute during the pandemic, and the Department of Interior's report, I think, is an important step toward identifying and addressing some of these systemic issues. So Assistant Secretary Newland in the report recommended that the department continue its investigations to uncover the full scope of the atrocities of the Indian boarding school system historically. So last year, my colleague Representative Sharice Davids introduced the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies Act, which would establish a commission to investigate the Indian boarding school system. So how could this commission complement the continued efforts of the department to investigate and ultimately improve the Indian boarding school system?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I feel like the commission, this is something we have been having conversations, discussions within the department. By bringing in different stakeholders to be part of the commission could definitely benefit. We need to hear the voices of former students. We need our congressional staff on there. But I'm actually a member of this commission. And I look forward to that collaboration because, again, it's important that we have our tribal leaders, our stakeholders from our tribes and our communities in these communities of our residential schools to be part. We need to hear what they went through, their experiences, and what we need to avoid moving forward.
Thank you, Director. And in my remaining few seconds, I just want to, again, thank you for working to improve conditions at Chemawa. One of the things that we've spoken about over the years is the need for more Native educators. And I know that has been a challenge. I hope progress is being made in that regard. You mentioned Oregon is one of the states that where the teacher pay at the state level is higher than at the Indian boarding school. I hope we can resolve that issue and you can continue to recruit not only excellent teachers, but excellent Native teachers. It really does make a difference for the students there. And I'm now out of time and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bonamici. I now like to remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, materials for submission for the hearing record must be submitted to the committee clerk within 14 days following the last day of the hearing. So by close of business on July 12th, preferably in Microsoft Word format. The material submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. Only a member of the committee or an invited witness may submit materials for inclusion in the hearing record. Documents are limited to 50 pages each. Documents longer than 50 pages will be incorporated into the record via an internet link that you must provide to the committee clerk within the required time frame. But please recognize that in the future, that link may no longer work. Pursuant to House rules and regulations, items for the record shall be submitted to the clerk electronically by emailing submissions to ed.hearings@mail.house.gov. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for their participation today. Members of the subcommittees may have some additional questions for you, and we ask you to please respond to those questions in writing. The hearing record will be open for 14 days in order to receive those responses. I remind my colleagues that pursuant to committee practice, witness questions for the hearing record must be submitted to the majority committee staff or committee clerk within 7 days. The questions submitted must address the subject matter of the hearing. I now like to recognize Mr. Obernotti for his closing statement, please.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Sablon. I want to thank you very much, Director Dearman, and Ms. Sirwa from the GAO. It's been a very productive hearing, and I want to continue having these hearings as we work towards getting the BIE off of the high-risk list at the GAO, but also as we help the BIE in fulfilling their critically important role in providing education to the nearly 40,000 students that they're responsible for. So I think we're all on the same page about that in that sense. And so I want to thank everyone for their dedication towards reaching that goal. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You'll back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member Obernotti, and I'll recognize myself for the purpose of making my closing statement. Thank you again to our witnesses for your time and testimony. I want to thank also our members for tuning in today, for joining us in this hearing. Today, we reflected on the important role the Bureau of Indian Education schools play in providing a high-quality education to American Indian and Alaska Native students that honors and preserves their heritage. Unfortunately, as our witnesses made clear, even before the pandemic, BIE students did not have the resources they needed to excel. And now the pandemic has compounded the consequences of multi-generational neglect and left BIE students further behind. While Congress delivered historic resources to protect the health and safety of students and educators and to make up for lost time, these investments alone will not solve the persistent problems BIE schools and students face. Now, together, we must deliver sustained support to ensure we uphold the constitutional commitment and moral responsibility to educate American Indian and Alaska Native students. I would like to think that we will come back and we will continue to review this to keep our eyes on this issue on BIE education, and also come back in some future time to another oversight hearing to see how much movement we have progressed towards the future. So, but for now, thank you, Director Dearman and Ms. Sirwa. And I look forward to working with my colleagues to fulfill this commitment. Thank you again for our witnesses. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. And thank you.